What's up, people? This is Nate Morris, MasterLSAT.com, and in this video, we're going to master the first reading comprehension passage from the May 2020 LSAT-Flex. So if you haven't already taken that test, follow the link in the description below, try it first on your own, and then we'll master all the questions you had trouble with together. We start by going through the passage itself. And then, for each question, we go over the question first and talk about what to look for in the answer choices. Then we go over each individual answer choice. You can use the timestamps below to jump in between questions. Okay, we're going to look at the first reading comp passage from the May 2020 LSAT-Flex. Let's start by spending a couple minutes going over the passage just to make sure that we got all the main points of each paragraph well understood. So, Paragraph 1 basically starts by introducing this method of hazardous waste disposal called deep well injection, right? It starts off by saying that a lot of societies are having trouble figuring out what to do with their toxic waste, right? Landfills and incinerators have recently become more regulated and expensive, and so a lot of industries are turning to deep well injection. What is deep well injection? That's where you drill a well into porous rock strata underneath the ground that's saturated with salt water, and you basically inject your liquid waste into that underground area. And then it mentions that generally the depth is between 300 meters deep and 1,800 meters deep, right? We don't want it to be less than 300 meters deep because then there's a danger of it mixing with an aquifer of drinking water. We don't want that to happen, obviously. And it says it's generally not going to be deeper than 1,800 meters because then it gets a little too expensive, and then below that depth it's more cost effective to use an alternative method. So it just explains what this method is generally, and then the paragraph ends by saying, however, it's become very controversial because there are 3 serious problems with this method. And then in the next couple of paragraphs, we're going to read about what those problems are. So paragraph 2 introduces 2 of the problems. The first 2 of the 3, right? Paragraph 2 says, under the best conditions, you inject the waste into rock strata that's saturated with salt water and separated by impermeable rock strata from aquifers that have water that people are going to drink. That makes sense, right? You want there to be rock that's impermeable, separating the waste and the drinking water. But then it says, however, injection wells can sometimes leak, which could allow a lot of those chemicals to mix with the drinking water. That's a big problem, obviously. That's problem number 1. And then it says, in other cases, mistakes by personnel working on the wells might lead to the pollution of aquifers. And then it gives an example of one case where the workers installed a 500-meter deep well. So that's good. That's within the ideal depth, right? That's deep enough. That's deeper than the 300-meter minimum that we learned about in the first paragraph. But they left a gap along about 30 meters of its casing, which allowed waste to escape at a depth of only 200 meters, which of course is in the danger zone, right? Those first 300 meters, we don't want any waste leaking out. And it says it threatened a regional aquifer supplying water to so many people. And because these accidents take place deep within the earth, it's very hard to discover them, and by the time we figure out that they are happening, it could be that a lot of people have been exposed to dangerous levels of waste by that point in time. So this paragraph points out those 2 issues, right? We said there were 3 dangers, right? The 2 problems mentioned in this paragraph are there could be leaks, the injection wells could leak, and there could be personnel errors, right? Then the next paragraph says, here's a 3rd problem associated with deep well injection, which is it's very difficult, nearly impossible to predict how these wastes are going to be moving around underground. How will they be acted on by the geological features of the area? Unlike surface water, the water underground doesn't flow entirely under the influence of gravity, right? It's deep underground. So it moves along subterranean pressure gradients. It can flow in any direction, and sometimes it can go long distances, thousands of meters per year, and we don't really know how to predict how they're going to move, and it says they can go through porous rock or geological faults. They could kind of end up anywhere, so we don't really know. We can't predict necessarily where that waste is going to end up. That's the 3rd problem. And then the last paragraph kind of just summarizes everything, and it says the uncertainty about where these wastes will flow, that was what we just read about, that 3rd issue, along with the possibilities of mechanical failure and human error, that was the first 2 issues, makes this method a risky means of hazardous waste management. And then it says, unfortunately, we're using it more and more. Societies are turning to this more. Industry will rely increasingly, as societies are producing more toxic waste, industry will unfortunately rely increasingly upon this cheap but controversial method of waste disposal. So basically, if we sum everything up, the first paragraph introduced this method to tell you what it is, how it works, but then it said, but there's 3 dangers with it. And then the next 2 paragraphs told you what those 3 dangers are, and then the final paragraph basically concluded, right? It summed up those dangers, and it said, unfortunately, we are doing this more and more because it's cheap and effective, but it is dangerous, right? So I think we understand hopefully all the points of each paragraph. So let's go ahead and attack the questions. We should be able to hopefully fly through at least the first few of them. Question number 1, what's the main point of the passage? So we always want to try to predict the answer, right? If you had to say in your own words what the main point of the passage was as succinctly and accurately as possible to someone who hadn't read the passage, how would you say it? Well, I think if it were me, I would just say deep well injection, this method for storing hazardous waste, is something that industries are doing more and more, but it is dangerous. It carries dangers with it. I think that's the main point, right? It's hard to say anything other than that, right? Deep well injection is something that industries are doing, but it's dangerous, right? And here are all the dangers, and here's why we should be worried about it. So basically, something like that is what we're looking for in the answer choices. A says deep well injection of these wastes is unsafe, period. If there was a period there, maybe this would be the right answer. But then it says it's unsafe when expensive precautions are not taken. Huh? When did it ever say that? There was never a conditional aspect to this. The point of the passage was much simpler. It was just saying it is unsafe. Not that it's unsafe when we don't take expensive precautions. What expensive precautions? Where was that mentioned anywhere? So this doesn't make sense. B is kind of backwards. B says, although this method can be unsafe, it is generally safe when we follow proper procedure. That wasn't the main point. We weren't trying to say that it is generally safe, right? B sounds like, don't worry, even though it could be unsafe, generally nothing to worry about. No, just the opposite. The point of this passage was saying, no, there is very much what to worry about. This method is being used more and more, and it is dangerous. And that was how we ended off, and that was the conclusion of the passage. So B is a little bit backwards. That was not a point being made by the passage. C kind of misses the boat because C says, because of high costs and extensive regulations associated with other methods, deep well injection has totally replaced these alternative methods of getting rid of hazardous waste. Now, it does mention in the first few lines that there were costs and regulations with these other methods that perhaps has led companies to start using deep well injection. So perhaps this is true, but it's not the main point of the passage. The main point of the passage is saying, and it's very unsafe. There are all these problems associated with its safety, right? So C totally misses the boat on that. Remember, that was the whole bulk of the passage, right? We introduced the method in the first paragraph, and then the whole remainder of it was, here are all the issues with it, and here's why it's unsafe, and it's a worrying issue, right? It's something that we should be worried about. C doesn't mention that dimension at all, so therefore it cannot possibly be the main point. So D is perfect, right? D says exactly what we wanted to say. The fact that industries are using deep well injection more and more is problematic. It's worrisome. It's dangerous. That's the point of the passage, right? We brought all these reasons why it's dangerous, and that was basically the thesis, is that industries are using this method, but we should be worried about it. It carries risks with it, and therefore this is very simply the correct answer. E may be true, but it's not the main point, right? The main point of the passage wasn't saying that careful design and location of sites for deep well injection is important because of the fact that we rely on groundwater for drinking. Yes, that is true, but that kind of misses the main point. The main point was saying that, therefore, since all these things end up going wrong a lot of the time, that this is a dangerous method, right? That this is a dangerous activity that industries are doing. E doesn't say that. E doesn't say it is dangerous, right? That is very simply the main point, is that industries are using this method, and that we should be worried about the fact that it's being used more and more because it has all these dangers associated with it. E is just a very kind of peripheral, micro point that isn't the main point of the entire passage. Number 2, we're looking for something that we can infer from the passage, so one of these answers will be sourced somewhere in the passage, and of course the other 4 will not be. A is about landfills and incinerators, and A says the use of those things is no longer considered safe. Where did it say that? We mentioned them in a sentence or two at the very beginning of the first paragraph. We mentioned that regulations and expenses for them have increased a lot in recent years, and therefore industries, in an effort to save time and money, are turning towards this deep well injection thing that the whole rest of the passage is about, right? We never mentioned that it's no longer considered safe. We just said it's gotten more expensive and more regulated, but we never talked about the safety of these other methods. B doesn't really make sense. B says injection of these wastes at depths of more than 1,800, deeper than 1,800 meters underground is less expensive but more dangerous than if you do it at 300 meters. That doesn't make sense right off the bat. Why would it be less expensive? We actually said that deeper than 1,800 meters is actually where it gets too expensive, right? It says towards the end of the first paragraph that these wells are rarely deeper than 1,800 meters because below that depth, it would be more cost effective to find a different method. In other words, the implication is that it gets more expensive. It gets too prohibitively expensive under that depth. So why would you say it's less expensive? That doesn't really make any sense. C makes perfect sense. It's kind of one of the main points of that third paragraph, right? Remember that third paragraph, and the point was saying that we don't know how the waste is going to travel underground. It could go in any direction, and it could go very long distances, right? It mentions at the end of the paragraph that it could be transported thousands of meters per year from the initial site, and it could go through faults, porous rock, or other rock formations. And so therefore, if there were some sort of aquifer of drinking water that were thousands of meters from the site, it could permeate that, right? That's the point of this paragraph. That's why we have to be worried about it. And that's exactly what C is saying. And therefore, C comes straight from the passage and is correct. Very simple. D is not correct because, just like A, it's about disposal in landfills. It's about one of these other methods that was mentioned in the first couple sentences, which we know nothing about. All we know about those two methods is what it says in that sentence, which is that they've become more expensive and more regulated. D says that unlike deep well injection, even though disposal of waste in landfills involves a bunch of risks, unlike deep well injection, it doesn't involve the risk of contaminating water. Says who? Where did we ever read that from anywhere? It doesn't say anything about the risks associated with putting waste in landfills. It just says it's become more expensive and more regulated. So if it's not one of those two things, then it's not something we know about it. E is actually backwards, right? E says that the drinking water wells are lower down than the wells that we drill for deep well injection, but it's the other way around, right? It says in the first paragraph that no, that specifically we have to drill these wells to below 300 meters because that's the minimum depth that puts the waste at a safe distance below any aquifer which contains drinking water. So we actually want to get it below the drinking water, deeper than the drinking water. E says it's the other way around, so therefore E is wrong. 3, we want to look for something that would strengthen the author's argument. The author's argument about the risks of deep well injection of hazardous waste, which is basically that it could end up in places that we don't want it. It could end up in the drinking supply, etc. So we want to strengthen that argument and show that, yes, we have what to be concerned about here. So let's look for something that does that. A is pretty much backwards. If anything, this weakens the argument because A says that few of the formations that industries use for deep well injection are adjacent to or connected to drinkable groundwater. So that kind of sounds like there's nothing to worry about because it sounds like, generally speaking, they are not near drinkable groundwater, right? Few of them, meaning most of them generally are not, is what A is saying, right? Not near drinkable water. So that kind of sounds like we have less to worry about than the author initially thought, right? So this doesn't make sense. It's backwards. B is irrelevant to the author's argument because the author's position regarding the risks of deep well injection is that it carries risks towards humans. It could get into the human drinking supply. B is about non-humans. B says few of these substances that are disposed of have been thoroughly tested for their effects on non-humans. Well, first of all, just because we haven't thoroughly tested them, that doesn't really mean much, right? That doesn't tell us that it's good or bad. It just says we haven't tested them, right? That's first of all. Second of all, B is about non-humans, and the author's argument is only about humans, right? The author's argument about the risks is that it could end up in the human drinking supply, and therefore B is not going to help. C is very much neither here nor there because C says a lot of the sites where they do this are many miles from the facilities that use them for waste disposal. So the facility of whatever the company is that's using this site, their facility's over here, and then many miles away is where they choose to do the deep well drilling. What does that matter? What does it matter if they do it next door to their facility or far away from their facility? That has nothing to do with how dangerous it is or how much we should be worried about it. D is perfect because D says the movement of underground water is even quicker and less predictable than most geologists have thought, right? Remember, the point of the third paragraph was that this third danger of the three dangers we mentioned in the passage is that water underground, this waste water that we're injecting into the ground, it's very unpredictable to figure out which direction it's going to go, and it could go long distances, right? It could go, it says, thousands of meters per year, right? And according to the author, that was something we should be worried about. And it sounds like it is something we should be worried about. And D strengthens that argument because D says it's even more rapid and even less predictable than we thought, right? So that exactly strengthens the argument because the argument is saying it's very rapid and very unpredictable. And D says even more than we thought. So it very much directly amplifies a point being made by the author. So it's the correct answer. E doesn't make sense because E says that methods of predicting and monitoring movement of underground water have gotten better since the time that the author gathered the data here, right? If anything, that weakens the argument because the author's whole point is that we don't know how to predict the movement of this wastewater underground. But E says, nah, don't worry about it. We've actually improved the way that we can determine where it's going and predicting and monitoring its movement, right? So E actually counters what the author's saying. So if anything, it weakens the argument. Number 4, according to the passage, what is true about underground water? So let's look for something that is sourced somewhere in the passage. A is definitely backwards. A says that underground water can be suitable for public drinking water even when it's contaminated by low levels of waste. No, that kind of runs counter to our whole point here. Our whole point was that no, we should be worried that we're contaminating this drinking water with waste. And A says, nah, it can be suitable as drinking water even if it's a little contaminated. So that is not sourced anywhere in this passage. B is definitely not true. B says that we can seldom find underground water at depths of less than 200 meters in areas where we practice deep well injection. I don't know where the source for that would be, right? We said specifically that the drinking water is in those first 300 meters, right? It said that in the first paragraph, that specifically we try to deal deeper than 300 meters, right? So that we get deeper enough than the drinkable water. So it sounds like the drinkable water is in the first 300 meters, right? And specifically, even in that example that we gave a couple paragraphs later, right? Or actually in the next paragraph, the example that we gave was that waste escaped at a depth of 200 meters, and it sounds like that was close to a drinking supply, right? So it kind of sounds like there is drinkable water around 200 meters deep. So there's definitely no source for B being true. C was not something that was ever said by the passage, right? Where did we ever say that underground water can almost never be used as a source of water for industrial processes? What industrial processes? Where in here did we ever mention any industrial processes that we need to find water and use for those processes? I don't know where this would have come from, right? It never says that we can't use underground water for industrial processes. It sounds like we are using underground water for drinking, but we might also be taking it out of the ground and using it for some industrial process, right? That was not really the topic of this passage. This passage was about taking waste and depositing it underground. It wasn't about using underground water for something else. D doesn't make sense. D says that underground water can contain a lot of salt as a result of being contaminated by deep well injection, but that's not true because if you read the passage says that how does deep well injection work according to the first paragraph? We drill wells into rock strata that are already saturated with salt water. So it's not that the injection is making it more saturated with salt, it's already saturated with salt water. So therefore this doesn't make sense. E is perfect. This is pretty much what the point of the third paragraph was, which is that it can move, underground water that is, can move from one underground formation to another underground formation due to non-gravitational factors, right? If we read that paragraph, right, that middle sentence in that paragraph, it says, unlike surface water, underground water doesn't flow entirely under the influence of gravity. It moves along subterranean pressure gradients. It can flow in any direction, and we don't really know, we can't predict so much where it's going to end up. So that was the whole point here, is that it's not just gravity. It moves due to other factors, and that makes it hard to predict where it's going to end up. So this kind of just sums up sort of the main point of this paragraph, so it's a perfect answer. Number 5, what is the purpose of deep well injection? Well, that should be easy. We simply have to consult the first paragraph where we were introduced to deep well injection. And specifically, there was one sentence or so where the author defined what it was, right? We first hear about deep well injection for the first time in about the third sentence. The author introduces it, right? Mentions that we are seeing increased use of deep well injection. What is deep well injection? Well, the next sentence tells us, in this method, wells are drilled into porous and permeable rock strata that are saturated with salt water. So that's the definition of deep well injection, right? We inject into those deep areas, and then of course we deposit waste into those deep areas. So let's look for something like that in the answer choices, just a general definition of what this is. A, there's no support for it. It never says that it's only a short-term storage method and we wait for the toxicity to neutralize and then we take it out. It never mentions that anywhere. It sounds like it's a permanent place to store this waste, right? At least we're not given any indication otherwise. B is not something that's mentioned anywhere. It never says that deep well injection makes above ground waste disposal methods obsolete. Where does it say that, right? In fact, the author is arguing that no, we should use other methods instead of this, or at least we shouldn't be using this method as much. So it doesn't sound like it makes other methods obsolete, and that's certainly not its purpose, right? The question is, what is the purpose of deep well injection? The purpose is to make other methods obsolete? No, the purpose is to store waste, right? That doesn't really answer the question, even if it were accurate. C is perfect. It's a synopsis of the purpose of deep well injection. It stores hazardous waste in these underground saltwater saturated areas. That comes straight from that fourth or so sentence of the passage where it says, in this method of waste disposal, what method? Deep well injection, right? In this method of waste disposal, we drill wells into underground rock strata that are already saturated with salt water, and then we store the waste there. That's exactly what the passage says. Very easy question. D is not supported by the passage. We never read anywhere that these underground pools of waste can be easily and continuously and reliably monitored, right? If anything, the author is warning in the third paragraph about how we can't really monitor where this waste ends up. We have no idea where it goes, and it doesn't sound like we can monitor it at all, right? It sounds like the opposite of what D is saying. And furthermore, even if we could, that's not the purpose, right? Let's try to remember what the question is asking. We want to answer the question. What is the purpose of deep well injection of hazardous waste? To store hazardous waste underground, right? Not to create pools of waste that can be easily and continuously and reliably monitored, right? To store, to contain hazardous waste underground, right? And D doesn't really capture that, aside from the fact that it's simply not accurate or based in the passage. E is definitely not supported by the passage, right? It doesn't sound like we're recycling the waste, and it doesn't sound like the waste is necessarily low toxicity, so this doesn't really have any support from anywhere. Number 6, according to the passage, what has deep well injection become? This method that we are talking about. What has it become? Well, if we look at the answer choices, they all start with either more controversial because or more widely accepted because. Now, here's the rub. It's actually become both of those things, right? So it's going to come down to the reasoning, to the second half of the answer choice to determine which one is accurate and which 4 are inaccurate, right? Because the first paragraph does point out that it has become more widely used, more widely accepted, right? It says a couple sentences in that many industries have turned to alternative methods of waste disposal, such as including deep well injection. So it does seem to be picking up steam, right? It does seem to have become more widely accepted, right? And it's also become more controversial, as it says at the end of this paragraph, right? It says it's become a matter of controversy, right? So it has become more controversial due to the dangers, etc., all the stuff that we were reading about in the passage. So both of these two things seem to be true from the passage. We just have to look for the reasoning at the end of the answer choice to see which of these 5 answers is actually accurate. A is exactly correct, and it's exactly one of the sentences that we pointed to when we introduced the question, right? It says at the end of the first paragraph, 2 sentences from the end, that this method, deep well injection, has become a matter of controversy as more and more communities have come to rely on underground sources for drinking water. Literally exactly what A says. That's exactly the source for that, so it's straight from the passage, and therefore A is the correct answer. B would make sense that it would probably become more controversial if this happened, if there were an increase in toxin-related illnesses near the sites of deep well injection, but there's no evidence that that has actually happened. It doesn't say that anywhere in the passage that actually has happened, and therefore there's no source for this. C is a little bit tricky because C says that deep well injection has become more widely accepted because newly developed alternatives are more costly. The passage never says that. It does say, it mentions a couple things at the beginning of the first paragraph. In the second sentence, it says that landfills and incinerators have gotten more costly, and a lot of industries are therefore turning to deep well injection instead. But those things, landfills and incinerators, it never says that those are newly developed alternatives, right? It sounds like they've been around for a while and they've just been getting more expensive and more regulated, and that's why we're turning to deep well injection instead, right? So it never says they're newly developed, and that's the major problem with C. D doesn't really make any sense because D says that deep well injection has become more widely accepted because the public is becoming more aware of environmental issues. That's not why deep well injection has become more used. It says in the second sentence of the passage that the reason deep well injection has been becoming more and more widely used is because landfills and incinerators have gotten more costly and regulated, and so therefore industries are turning to deep well injection instead. Not because the public is becoming more aware of environmental issues. Why would that lead people to use deep well injection? That doesn't make any sense. The whole point of the passage is that deep well injection also poses a danger to the environment in terms of the drinking water. So D doesn't make any sense. E doesn't really make any sense. Why would deep well injection be becoming more widely accepted because of how highly toxic the wastes are that we are injecting underground? That doesn't make any sense, right? The passage is saying the fact that we're injecting toxic waste underground is making this whole thing kind of dangerous. So why would the fact that they're so toxic be making this method more popular? That doesn't make any sense. And of course, it doesn't say that anywhere in the passage anyway. Number 7, a lot of people missed this question. Let's read it carefully. The question itself is very simple. Based on the passage, what would be the ideal characteristics of a site, an area that's suitable for this method, deep well injection? Well, we don't have to guess at it, right? We should know what we're looking for because it's described in the first paragraph, right? The first paragraph says that you want to go to a depth of at least 300 meters, but not lower than 1,800 meters. So between 300 meters below ground to 1,800 meters below ground, right? So a lot of people realize that, and thus we're able to narrow this question down to 2 answers because 2 answers fit that criteria. But one of them makes more sense than the other, which we will see very shortly, right? Because remember, what is the goal here? The goal is to not have the toxic waste mix with the drinking water. The drinking water is above the 300 meter mark. So we want to put it safely below that so that it doesn't mix with that drinking water, which is higher up than the waste will be. So let's keep that in mind and take a look at the answer choices. A is a little tricky. A lot of people pick this answer, but it doesn't really make sense if we read it carefully, right? It starts off on the right path because we want there to be something 300 meters below the surface, right? But what should be 300 meters below the surface for the area to make sense? A says there's a layer of impermeable rock below which there are no permeable layers. That doesn't really make any sense, right? Because we have to find permeable rock to drill, right? First of all, A doesn't have any permeable rock, right? The whole method, as it's described in the first paragraph, is that we drill into porous and permeable rock, right? That's just how it works. If there's no porous and permeable rock, then you can't even do it, right? So A just says there's a layer of impermeable rock below which there are no permeable layers. So it sounds like A is terrible because we want to, as we pointed out when we introduced the question and a couple times throughout working through this passage, we want to go deeper than 300 meters, right? So A is exactly the opposite of what we want because A says you can't go deeper than 300 meters because at 300 meters, there's only impermeable rock below which there's also only impermeable rock, right? So therefore A would not work and is the wrong answer. B says that the area would be suitable if 300 meters or more below the ground level, there's a layer of permeable rock. Makes sense so far, right? You need there to be permeable rock in order for this method to work because according to the first paragraph, how does this work? what is deep well injection? It's drilling into porous and permeable rock. If it's not permeable rock, you can't drill into it, right? So you need to have porous, permeable rock, and you want it to be 300 meters or lower. So far B looks good, right? 300 meters or more below the surface, we have permeable rock. And then B gets even better because it says above which there's a layer of impermeable rock, right? Which will solve the problem potentially of having it leak into the water supply. Remember, we don't want to have it go up into the water supply. We're worried about the drinking water being within the first 300 meters. So B makes perfect sense because you can have your cake and eat it too. You can drill into permeable rock that's at the right depth, and there's a layer of impermeable rock that's going to stop the waste from getting into the drinking water supply. So if you think about it, if you use your mind, B makes perfect sense based on the information from the passage. C doesn't really make any sense because C says the area has impermeable rock extending from near the surface to a depth of at least 300 meters. Okay, great. It's good that we have all that impermeable rock, but where's the permeable rock, right? How does deep well injection work? According to the first paragraph, it works by drilling into permeable rock. So you need to have some permeable rock for this to work. D doesn't make any sense because D says the ideal area would be one in which at a depth of 300 meters or less, there's an aquifer with water, right? If anything, that's what we want to avoid. Remember, the whole thrust of this passage is that we want to avoid contaminating water supply, right? So why would the fact that there's water, why would that make it ideal? That doesn't really make sense. E has the depth all wrong. E says there's a layer of impermeable rock overlain by a layer of permeable rock 1,800 meters or more underground, right? That's not the ideal depth, right? We said in the first paragraph that 1,800 meters and deeper, that's where it gets too expensive. We said that explicitly in the first paragraph towards the end, and therefore this is definitely wrong. If you found this video useful, don't forget to hit subscribe. And for thousands more clear LSAT explanation videos, go to masterlsat.com.